afternoon. Our next session is a very incredible session. We are having our very own remarkable scholar, Dr. Mshai Mwangola, in conversation with the phenomenal Abdulrazak. Please help me in welcoming them on stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now, you know, when I'm here, usually I like to hear the audience because I know what it's like to be sitting and you're looking at all these faces. And I know our esteemed guest has probably gotten very used to that, but I'm very nervous. So help me out by making me feel you really want us to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very, very much. I know, like me, you've all been really waiting for this opportunity for us to have a conversation with the guest that I'm so privileged to be speaking to, Abdulrazak Gurnah. And as has been said, every one of our festival guests is so, so special to us. It is such an honor to have every one of them. But with Abdulrazak Gurnah, one of the things I just want to say again, thank you to you, is that this was a commitment made many, many years ago. And you know how it is, even you promised people things you would do for them in 2020 when it was 2019. And it's always special when we wait 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years later, they still honor that commitment. So karibu sana. Welcome again to Nairobi and welcome to this conversation. We're going to start by just having a bit of a conversation between me and him, and then we'll start with a reading, and I've invited him to just pick a reading from any one of his books. As you know, and I'm sure you've got them out there is Afterlives. This is the latest of his books, but then also we have a couple of others that you might also want to pick up. The Last Gift, By the Sea, and we also have Paradise. And so I have requested that he will do a reading. So we'll do a couple of readings from those. And then I'm going to open it out so that we can really have a conversation. I know for many of you, Sunday afternoons, it's a time to meet up with family. You people don't meet with your families on Sundays. So let's have a family conversation. So may I start by asking you just to do a reading from any of the books of your choice? And he has picked Paradise. How many of us have read Paradise? Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the welcome. Thank you very much for turning up. I'm going to read a passage after the journey when Yusuf is describing to Khalil what he had seen.
That happens to me all the time. And then in my vanity, I try to read with my natural eyes, and then I have to start looking like, where are the glasses?
So, the lakeside town lay in soft, impossible light, violet with an edge of crimson from the great cliffs and hills which formed the banks. Boats were pulled up along the water's edge, and a row of small brown houses lined the bank. The lake stretched away in all directions, making the men lower their voices with the feeling the sight stirred in them. The travelers waited outside the town, as was their custom, until permission was granted for entry. A shrine stood nearby, surrounded by snakes and pythons and wild animals. Only if the spirit allowed it could a person reach the shrine safely and leave in peace. Muhammad Abdullah told them this as they waited, pointing to a grove not far from their resting place. That's where their God lives. Savages believe anything if it's crazy enough, he said. It's no good saying to them that this or that is childish. You can't argue with them. They only tell you endless stories about their superstitions. Actually, because I was asked to select a passage just a moment ago. I thought I was picking the passage about Khalil and Yusuf having conversation, but in the dark, unfortunately, I couldn't see. So give me a moment to find the passage I was really meaning to read to you.
So I had actually originally, we talked about doing a passage from Afterlives, but then I thought, you know what often happens when you meet a writer is we always want them to read from their latest work. And often many of us haven't had a chance to also encounter other work that they have done. And one of the things we'll be talking about is this journey from where did we start and how we are to where we are. So at the last minute, I said, why don't we also do something from another book as well? So thank you for indulging me.
The reason I picked that passage, because I knew it began with later, as did that one. So that's what fooled me in the dark. Later, Yusuf could not remember the moment of their arrival. The days after their return were crowded with mobs of people circling the house and the clearing, clamoring to be heard. The porters and guards were there too, telling tales of their heroic survival and grumbling about their luck as they waited to be paid off. A village of tents and campfires arose in the large yard by the merchant's house, visited day and night by the curious and by street traders selling them food and coffee. Ramshackle kiosks appeared by the side of the road, and the aromas of grilled meat and frying fish drew knots of people to them. Flocks of scavenging crows abandoned their affairs to lurk on nearby trees, their sharp, bright eyes restlessly on the lookout for an unguarded morsel. Mounds of rubbish dotted the edges of the encampment, and thin rivulets of sluggish slime oozed out of them as the days passed. The merchant received a stream of visitors on the terrace in front of the shop. The old men who usually sat there graciously made space, but silently resisted eviction. They too wanted to stay close to the drama of the merchant's return. The manner of the merchant's visitors was solicitous, and they spent many idle hours with him, listening to his account of the journey with sudden exclamations or small cries of commiseration. While they chatted and drank coffee, the agitated crowds wheeled around them. At times, one or other of the visitors took out a notebook and jotted something down, or strolled round to the stores by the side of the house. Muhammad Abdullah was installed in one of the stores, still recovering from exhaustion and fever, and suffering strange pains, which had begun after the beating in Chatu's town. A length of cloth hung over the open doorway to his room, billowing languidly when there was any breeze. The visitors stopped to greet him and wish him well before going on to glance into the other stores. They've come to pick the Sayyid's bones, Khalil said to Yusuf.
Thank you very much. And the reason I asked you to pick a passage at random from one of the books is I just wonder if you perhaps would like just to set why you picked Paradise out of all the books that were offered, and in a way out of why this was the passage that you thought might be a good way of entering into this conversation.
Well, I picked it because I knew I wanted to read something from Afterlives, partly because this is something that I have done or that writers often do. If you're asked to read something, I usually read something from the latest book. Not only because it's the one that's nearest to what I've just been doing, but often it's because of a way of saying to people, go buy this one. That is to say, if you are talking to people who are already your readers, then you know that quite likely they will have perhaps read some of the others or have bought some of the others. But so it's a way of also saying, you may not know about this new one, but go read it. This is probably not necessary anymore, but you get into that habit of doing things. But why Paradise? Well, partly because the two books are connected in some way. So even though, if you remember, I said to you, I'll read something from By the Sea, but then on second thought, I thought, oh no, maybe paradise would work better with afterlives. So it's nothing complicated. Why that passage? Well, I suppose I like that passage because there's something about it which is both, it's the end of the journey. They've survived, they've come through, but also it's also the beginning of another havoc, as it were. That's particularly for the merchants.
Okay. And for those of us who do not know what paradise is about, I'm very interested in this question of merchants and journeying because this is something I'm very invested in. Could you just tell us, just a little bit, just sketch the world in which this is connected? Because we are going to go on to afterlives, and then we would be able to make the connections because you said the two are somewhat connected.
Okay. I'm not sure if I'll talk about paradise, but I'm not sure if I understand exactly. So you can refocus me if I'm not addressing what you're interested in. The period in which paradise happens is quite just before the 1914-1918 war. So I guess it'll be about the 1900s, something like this. It'll be a period which in that location, during which the Germans were just establishing the authority, if you like, as a colonial power. And I was interested in that period. The territory became a German territory in the sense of the maps the European nations drew among themselves rather, in the 1880s. So I suppose it was really about 1890 or so before the attempted establishment of German power in the territory that then became Deutsche Ostafrika began. It took a while for that to actually work. So I am, as it were, at a moment in that novel when that authority or that desire for authority has not been established yet, but is in the process of being established. So, and their competitors in the first instance were the Swahili and Arab merchants who were traveling into the interior, doing business in the interior for a few decades. It wasn't such an ancient trade, really, even though ways of telling history make it seem as if it had been going on for centuries. But it wasn't really. It was only a kind of a 19th century phenomenon. But somehow, because of the way colonialism worked or works, it was necessary, the Portuguese did it, the British did it, the French did it, to establish a monopoly on trade, to actually make sure any competitors are either diminished or just simply abolished. So the first task for the Germans was to destroy the caravan trade, the trade from and the man who appears in Afterlives, or at least is mentioned in Afterlives, who was their contestant, was a man called Al-Bushiri. And it's known now in history as the Al-Bushiri Rebellion or Resistance or something like that. So it's tied in, although this is not a history lecture, but it's kind of that episode and events of that episode and that contestation that was taking place. So that's why merchant in the first place. That's why that rather than businessmen, say, because that's how these people would have seen themselves, as traders rather than people who sat, in their shops or in their offices to do business. They went and traded. This is what I bring you, and you give me something else in return. So I don't know if that's...
It is, because I think then where I want to go is, well, we're talking about the future of memories. And really what you're doing is you're saying this is part of the history that even when we come to afterlives, it's coming out of an older history and so on and so on. But then I feel that a lot of your work emerges out of a world that often we forget existed. It's almost as if for many of us, at least for me, I have to say when I think of the history of the past, it starts at a particular point. And the richness of what you describe when you talk about Zanzibar, when you talk about those spaces, and even the literary traditions that you come out of, seem to me to be connected to these very rich connections that come out of, if you want, a globalization, a global era, a global exchanges that are much bigger. And I'm wondering if I am thinking it out in a way that you will say that's completely not my reality.
No, no, not at all. Perhaps I would not have used globalization because it's a term that's associated with a different kind of, shall we say, spread of authority or spread of cultural power. I would think more like cosmopolitan might do it. Because one of the things about this term, cosmopolitan, is that it has actually been appropriated as something to do with Europe and North America. So the cosmopolitan is the person from Europe and North America who is actually open to other cultures. It's not the other way around. Nor is it the case that, so that assumes that there is a thing which is unitary, as well, unified, and that it somehow the other emerges from a kind of post-Enlightenment interest in the world, in cultures of the world and all this kind of thing. So that's what makes a cosmopolitan person or cosmopolitan scholar. So, but I prefer to think that cosmopolitan refers to cultures or webs of cultures that share something and participate in various activities, like, for example, exchanging stories or telling stories to each other, knowing about each other, reading each other's literatures, or even just hearing it if they're not a literate culture. And so the Indian Ocean, it seems to me, the littoral of the Indian Ocean is one of those cosmopolitan webs. Of course, there are many others. I mean, that idea of cosmopolitanism, for example, does not include the way there is the Far East cosmopolitan web, the Japanese or the Chinese or whatever, or others. It assumes that, this desire for knowledge emanates from a kind of if not just Europe and North America, but at least from a unified intellectual position. I think it's possible to, well, I'm sure it's possible to argue that other kinds of epistemologies, as it were, other kinds of forms and webs of knowledge exist, which are completely independent of that epistemology. And have been sustaining and self-sustaining for a long, long time and continue to be so.
And we can still see traces of it, even in the world that we inhabit today, and certainly the world that you came out of.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think it's still there. I don't think it's traces. I think it's absolutely there. And it lives alongside, and there's no reason why it shouldn't. It lives alongside other forms of cosmopolitan epistemologies. Obviously, at the moment, the world being as it is, for various reasons, the most powerful form of this is what emanates from Europe and North America, and to a certain extent elsewhere, China now as well, because of technology, because of forms of production, because of prosperity or whatever. But it doesn't mean that being poor doesn't mean that,
you don't have access to all of it.
You don't have an authentic form of culture and a cosmopolitan understanding of your own, which survives, which is self-sustaining and which survives.
When you say that, I think about, there's a story I love. I remember hearing that you recounted. I don't know if you would be as kind as to share it. But this is a story around your mother and you trying to study your way through a poem, and your mother, who was in Western, if we use those terms, illiterate, surprised you.
Yes, well, there's no need to worry about that. My mother was illiterate in almost any sense. I mean, she could not read or write in any, either in the Roman alphabet, as it were, or indeed in the Arabic alphabet. So she was like many women of her generation. She was illiterate. She couldn't read anything. But we were set, Al-Inkishafi is a 17th century Swahili poem, which came out of northern Kenya, out of Lamu. And it means the soul's awakening. So it's kind of semi-religious poem, really. Like a lot of the early classical Swahili poems. Not all, but like many of them. Anyway, it's a very famous poem. And we were set this poem at school, and the homework was to go and scan it, as they say, which is to say, go and put it into modern Swahili, so that of course, not as a poem, but as what it means. In other words, to say what the poem is doing. And the reason for being given such an exercise is because it was actually not immediately understandable. Like if you were to read, if you were English, say, let alone an English speaker, but even if you are English, a native speaker steeped in the language, if you are presented with a medieval poem, you would probably not be able to read it either. It might as well be Latin for all you could make of it. And the same was true of this. So here I am, doing this homework and grappling with this line of poetry and thinking, oh, I don't know what that means. And my mother recited the next two lines. That's the story. So I said, how did you know that? She said, well, everybody knows that. In other words, it's a story about, I suppose, about oral transmission, about how literature or certain kinds of literary artifacts were passed on so that even those who couldn't read really were party to it, were admitted into it.
So this was a written poem, but it was also transcending those boundaries.
Yes, it was a written poem, most definitely. But it was also, presumably, the transmission would be that it was read or recited often enough for people to be able to remember lines. I mean, I had similar experiences. There are poets like this in other languages as well, of course. For like in Farsi, Hafiz, apparently, I don't speak Farsi, but Hafiz, a very famous Persian poet, is so famous and so close to the lived life, as it were, of people that like almost in conversation, people quote each other lines of Hafiz. And I remember one incident. We had a presentation by a scholar at the University of Kent, where I was then working, on Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian novelist. And in the process of this presentation, the person who is himself Egyptian mentioned Hafiz and quoted a poem or a couple of lines which Mahfouz had used in one of the novels. And one of the students, one of the postgraduate students there, who is still a Persian, an Iranian, said, "Excuse me, you misquoted that. The line should be so and so."
One reason I love this is that the other conversation that comes to mind that we've had with some of the other writers, and I'm just very conscious of how so much of what you're saying is echoing some of the conversations, is that we often think about literature as something many of us encountered in school. And it's being, again and again, I'm being reminded that there's a whole community that is part of this production of literature, and not always the people that we tend to think. People like your mother, groups of women, scholars who are not scholars in the Western academy necessarily, but maybe in religious traditions or other traditions, are part of this. And this is the world that, even as we see you growing up for the 16, 17, 18 years or so that you were in Zanzibar, already you're being steeped in this alongside now the other traditions that are the familiar traditions from school.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say it's something else that's absent from there, and that's religion. Because a great deal, I think, of how we think about the world, this doesn't mean we have to be religious to do so, but it seems to me a great deal of how we think about the world is sort of bequeathed to us one way or another through the kind of the powerful religious forces, the religious stories in the cultures that we grow up in. I would have thought, it would be impossible to grow up in a Christian culture, Christian society, however secular Christian, without somehow absorbing all those various stories and various metaphors and so on. The same is true of somebody growing up in a Muslim culture, and I'm sure the same will be true of somebody growing up in a Hindu culture or other cultures. That these become kind of the basis, you use the word bedrock, I think, a little earlier on, of the stories, even if you're not acknowledged in that way. So there is a source of these, the great mix of narrative influences, I suppose you'd have to call them, which you don't even have to be aware of, but you utilize them and you use them because they're ways of your way of understanding the world.
So even as you're leaving Zanzibar, and I love what you said, this advantage of growing up in a cosmopolitan society is that you're being steeped into a lot of these influences. And because it's cosmopolitan, they are in conversation with each other. And they're shaping you whether or not you are aware of it. You're hearing groups of people speaking, singing, quoting, reading. And so by the time you are coming to move from this rich space to another space, which is the UK, which is, in the imaginary of many of us, this is now the real cosmopolitan space. You are now adding another layer. So I'm really looking at your intellectual journey. What was that like for you? Already having been really to it because you had been in a school in this tradition, but now you go to the UK and now this is another space and a whole lot of other influences. Was that very different from what you'd already experienced? Were there similarities? What was it that do you feel shaped you?
Well, I don't know if the last part of that question, I don't know if I can answer about what shaped me. But I can try to answer the previous part of the question, which is what was the experience of going to the UK like? It wasn't so much, it wasn't only rather, that they're now exposed to British culture. It was really something much bigger than that, in the sense that what opened up was exposure to a very wide range of different knowledges and cultures, which is part of the problem, really, of growing up in a small island where there is only a limited amount of reading available, and we didn't have the internet in those days, of course, so you couldn't even just Google things or anything like that. And one of the benefits, the great advantages for me, and perhaps for many of us, of going to somewhere like the UK was the abundance of materials, books, and the world opens up. It wasn't meant for me, but it was there, it was available. So, I could partake of it. And it actually really opened up the world for me, not just about things I already knew or things in the UK, but also about other places, about being able to read and know and learn about other parts of the world. One thing. The other thing, of course, it brought me closer to the source of those very stories that had been part of my colonial education. And now you had a different perspective on it, because there you are. And these stories now read differently, or they sound different from the way that they sounded or the way that they appeared when you were learning them in Zanzibar, say. So it was possible then to reconsider, to reevaluate many things that I thought I knew, not just about England and Britain, but also about the history of the encounter between England and me and us. And also it made me understand something else that's important, and that became part of the impulse for wanting to write. And that is the unsatisfactoriness of the stories that were told about us. So, there was something to do. There was something to do about that, but there was also something to do because, I was learning things and wanted to reevaluate what I knew and what I understood. So the experience of going to the UK didn't kind of didn't cancel something out. It made it necessary to look at it again, but it also opened up a lot of other things that perhaps would not have occurred to me if I hadn't had that experience. Well, at least I think so. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I don't think that things would have opened up quite so fully.
What influenced your choice of which degree to take? Why did you pick? Why not the sciences? Why didn't you become a historian? What influenced the space to say, this is the path I want to follow? And I'm going to follow up that with the fact that you then chose to become an academic.
I'm not a historian.
Yes, so why not?
Well, because I'm not a historian. I didn't study to be a historian.
Okay, so I'm going back to that. How do you make that
I'm a
decision?
literate scholar.
How
but
do you
not
make
a
that
historian.
decision that I
Okay,
want to be a literary scholar?
I'll tell you. Obviously, at that time, we're talking about 1967 or so, when I left Zanzibar. At that time, just soon after independence, almost every young person, I would guess, growing up in Africa, would have had it drummed into their heads, would have believed as well that you must go, if you have the opportunity to go and study something useful, which is to say, go and become a doctor,
Or a lawyer,
or a lawyer,
or an engineer.
or an engineer. Absolutely.
That hasn't changed much, has it?
So, and we weren't forced into thinking like that. We thought, yeah, sure, because that way you'll be useful. Nobody thought go and study literature, because what's the use of that? So when I went to England, that's what I did. When eventually we were able to get on with studying, I mean, my brother and I, because we left together, we both of us did A-levels in science. After we completed them, after 2 years, and rather a bit of a struggle, because by the second year, the money was running out, and it's very difficult to study in a strange place as young people, without family, without anybody saying, get down there and do it. It's very difficult when you don't have money. Anyway, we didn't do as brilliantly as we thought we might, which meant we all had to go. Anyway, the money had run out, and there was no possibility of studying. So I had to find a job. In those days, you couldn't do it now in the UK, but in those days you could. It was possible. So I went to work. Actually, I worked in a hospital as an orderly in an operating theatre for more or less 3 years. And in the process of doing that, as I started working there, I thought, I don't really want to be an engineer. Even though I'd actually already had an offer from a couple of universities with a place to go and study, except the money wasn't there. I thought, I don't really want to do this. And I remember writing a letter to my father saying, actually, on second thoughts, I've decided that I want to study literature. I have to say, I didn't receive a reply to that letter
Maybe just as well.
for a long, long time. But by that time, my mind was made up, as it were. So even though I was working at the hospital during that time, I started attending evening classes and did O-levels in literature and economic history, because you need two in order to go to university in any particular discipline. And I did that at the end of 1 year, rather foolhardily and recklessly. I said, right, I think I'm ready. And I took the exam and I passed.
Oh, well done.
So, and there was something else that was going on at the time, which again is no longer there, which is that if you worked for 3 years, if you're employed for 3 years, which means obviously you pay tax, you pay national insurance, etc., all the usual things that you have to do if you work in the United Kingdom. But after 3 years, you could apply for a grant. You became, eligible for a grant, which again, that's not so anymore. So then I was able to go to university, and then I was able to study literature.
I'm feeling for your parents here just for a second. I hope your brother did follow the science and the big thing path.
No. He went and did a useless thing called politics.
I really do feel for your parents. But then, so here you are, you're at university, you're studying literature, and it's helping you put all of these things together. And at some point, even as you're going through, you decide not just to do the first degree and then say, let me look for a job. You decide, actually, I kind of like what I'm doing. So you decide to go on to graduate school. At least I hope that's how the narrative goes. And then you decide, master's is not enough. Why not? Let me do a PhD. And all of this comes very easily to you because you're brilliant and a genius, and we all know all that. So how did that path develop?
It wasn't anything like that at all. Not at all. In fact, when I graduated, I went to teach school in a rather difficult school, actually, as it happened. And during that time, again, money was the issue. During that time, I started postgraduate studies part-time while I was teaching. And after 2 years of this, I was very fortunate to have a professor who had spent several years teaching at Makerere and Dar es Salaam before she were returned to the UK to become a professor at Kent. She wasn't my teacher as such, but because of her experience, she took an interest. And because the work that I was doing as a student, part-time student, she got to hear about it, and she basically managed to get me a scholarship to become a full-time student. And then I converted what I was doing, which was an MA, into a PhD. You could do that. Again, that's not something you can do anymore. And so then I did my PhD.
And somewhere along this point, you started writing. It seems to me you were working, you were, studying. You seem to have been very busy. Why did you start writing?
I was also not having, but I was making family as well. So
there you go.
I had a little daughter during this.
And anybody with a little daughter or little son knows that time is not something that you have in too much of abundance.
She was a great help. She used to scroll into my books all the time, so just putting her thoughts into, crime and punishment and whatever it is.
I hope you have acknowledged her in every book you've written as your co-writer, one way or the other. But why did you start writing?
Well, it came, I've described this so very often. Well, it came partly as a result of trying to understand the things that I mentioned earlier on, trying to understand both what I'd left behind or what I'd come to. Some of it was quite difficult, you see, because one obvious thing that we always, I think, have to remember, certainly I always remember, when I see people struggling, particularly young people, struggling across the Mediterranean, risking their lives to get to Europe, or indeed trying to cross the English Channel, I always think of what I found out was, you don't understand what you're leaving behind. So that's one thing I had to work out, to reflect on. What have I left behind? And why was it as it was? Why is it that we live as we do? And we do the things that we do? That's one thing. I also had to understand something about where I had ended up. And I did very quickly discover that I was a stranger, and not a very welcome one either. So understanding that, and understanding some of the things I mentioned earlier about the difference between what I thought I knew and what I did discover when I went to England. All of these things, these were things that were kind of not necessarily troubling, but things I had to work out, I had to think about. And I started writing them, not for anybody to read them or anything like that, but for me, in the way that sometimes writing is actually useful, even writing lists sometimes is useful, you know what I mean? You sort of at least know what needs to be done, kind of thing. And so I was doing it in this way, and there is, of course, something quite pleasurable about writing about how miserable you feel at a certain age, anyway. It's a rainy day, you feel really self-pitying and miserable, you write it down.
Journals and blogs.
And it passes the time and it makes you feel good. So it started really like that, just writing because I always enjoyed writing. But then it goes on, and I was finding myself fictionalizing, making a story of this and that and that. And I suppose at some point I made a decision. I said, listen, I'm going to have a go at this. But it was a secret decision. And that's how it began. So, well, it takes time. It takes ages and ages before any product is available.
Why would creative writing be the way to work this out rather than academic writing? Because you're already writing anyway.
Well, I didn't think of it as creative writing. I thought of it as just working things out.
In story form?
Even when it got to the story form, but we didn't at that time, I certainly didn't think of writing as creative writing. I thought writing was what it is. and that kind of, also I should say I was reading a lot at that time. I mentioned that earlier about one of the discoveries, if you like, of the unexpected benefits of being in the UK, being in England, was just how much there was to read. So I was reading a lot, and that too is a very important part of being or becoming a writer, I think. Not only because there's an example, but because that itself generates other inquiries, other ideas, other notions about there are other people who, I mean, I think this is the thing that as readers, what we experience is that it's a complex thing, of course, but one of the things we experience is, yeah, that's true, or that's how I feel, or I didn't know that. All of these combined ways in which we first identify, understand, learn. Oh, that's good. That's news. I didn't know that. All of these are part of reading. And of course, all of that excitement that I was getting from reading itself makes me think, I have a story to tell as well, like that.
So you start by, I'm writing to figure it out for myself, and then I have a story to tell that also is part of this. And I want to get it out there. And my question is, given that you were in, as you said, a society that wasn't all about people who look like you, think like you, feel like you, was this partly done because you said, I want to speak for people like me?
No, I didn't think like that. It's not because I didn't want other people to say, I think like that, but I didn't want to presume to speak for other people. That's the main reasons, really, that I refuse the idea of, I believe there is a kind of subtitle is that I only represent myself, which might be misleading, because it doesn't mean that I only speak for myself and don't speak for anybody. I'm saying I do not choose to announce that I do speak for anybody else. And if anybody finds an echo in what I say, that I think that I recognize that, or I agree with that, or smart fellow, he's really thought this through, I'm happy with that. But I don't want to claim to be,
the voice of.
Yeah, somehow, I speak for you, whoever it is.
Okay, so then we're coming, and you're graduating, you've got your PhD in hand, and at the same time, your first published novel.
Well, yeah, about right. You're jumping a few years, but
So I guess,
she makes it all sound so smooth.
Look, I am in awe. I did a PhD and I died. I can't imagine somebody doing anything else at the same time. So, hey.
Well, I actually was writing, not at the same time. I wasn't that clever, but I was writing my PhD at the same time I was writing what became Memory of Departure in due course. But it took a long time. The PhD was a lot more straightforward in many ways than writing the novel. There's a certain life goes on. I spent when I finished my PhD, I went to work in Nigeria for 2 years, which was both exciting, but also, again, a stranger. Once again, completely different circumstances to what I was used to, with all the usual problems. And Nigeria is not an easy place. Sorry, Nigerians, there are any here, but it's not an easy country to just go in and just smoothly get on with it. So it wasn't. I think by then I was starting my second novel, actually. But it was as those of you here who are writers will know, it's not a straightforward thing, this business. So you don't just write a novel and then it's finished and say, okay, that's done. Here you are, publish this. It takes a long time before that actually happens. So it was some years after that the first novel was published. But what was really interesting, good, I remember that year very well, because I came after Nigeria, I returned to the UK because my family had already gone back. And I worked in various other unsatisfactory jobs. But then in 1985, I got a job at the University of Kent. So I was able to return, as it were, to academic work. And that was also the year that first book was taken by Jonathan Cape. Okay. So it was great. From then on, it was just easy.
And you managed to maintain this academic career, but also really a career, a consistent, every so often bringing out books. And I think most of us know you for your novels, but you also you also work in other genres, short stories, nonfiction. And I was delighted to hear, and I'm hoping to get a commitment from you here, that you've done a play script or two, that maybe, we're at the National Theatre, maybe you're feeling inspired. Kenya National Theatre is 70 years old this year, and maybe we can get a commitment that we will premiere his play here. But tell me about the genre.
No. That's will not see the light of day.
Oh dear.
That's a long, long time ago. That's a.
But you did write a play script.
I did. I did. It was student production. So let's forget about that.
Are there students in the house? There you go. We've got students who'll be happy to take the play script. But go ahead.
No, actually, I was quite interested at one point. I was quite interested in drama, in plays, in directing, and so on. But I mentioned I taught when I finished my first degree, which included some drama in it. Then I went to teach secondary school in Dover. I taught a bit of drama there, and the school asked me, the headmaster asked me if I would produce the school play the following year or something like that. And we did. I chose to do, when you're young, you're stupid. This is a difficult school. I chose Ionesco's play Macbeth.
Mad respect to you.
And well, it was very difficult to do. It was very difficult to get these students to fully get into the spirit of UNESCO. And in fact, the person, my Ionesco, my Macbeth, got into such a panic that the day before the dress rehearsal, he developed an incredible migraine and had to go to. So the headmaster said, well, I'm afraid there's no choice. We've sold tickets. You'll have to do it. You're excused all your teaching for the next 2 days. Go and learn the part and do it. So I did. I learned the part.
You're an actor. Well,
I did do a bit of acting. So I learned the part and performed the lead role of Macbeth. And I thought, never again. So since then, I've had nothing to do with theatre.
There goes the dream of saying that we're going to premiere a play starring Abdulrazak Gurnah. But you also then do some short stories as well, I believe.
I do. Very often because somebody commissions one, says, we're doing something or the other, putting together a collection, or there's an event of some kind or another. Would you write something for us? So it's not a form that I'm drawn to immediately, as you were. But sometimes, as it happens, somebody asks, and I think, yeah, okay, I'll have a go, like that. Because quite often, even when I say I want to write a short story, like The Last Gift actually started like that, and so did Gravel Heart. Started as I will write a story. In the case of Gravel Heart, I thought I would write a story because I don't remember exactly. But in any case, I was away from home. And in those days, we didn't have mobile phones. So we were away for a few days. When I got back, I then received a phone call to say that she had died something like 5 days beforehand. And as you know, for Muslims, you have to bury somebody who has passed away before sunset, on the same day, in other words, or if it's at night, then before the next sunset. So she was long gone, long buried. The readings had all been done, and I'd missed it all. And it really made me feel strangely guilty So I thought, many years later, I thought I would write a story. But it didn't stop. It just kept growing. And that's what usually happens with my stories. If I start to write a story, it just keeps going, it ends up being a novel. So I think maybe I'm not cut out to be a short story writer.
I really want to come to the audience because I think this is such powerful, you've given us so much to think about. But I have one more question, actually two, but I'll do one and then do one after the other questions. A lot of your academic work and writing has been really devoted to illuminating, amplifying, helping people encounter, if you want, the work of other writers. And I remember I was reading something, or it was a conversation, somebody said, you're very compassionate and empathetic to your characters, but it also occurs to me that you extend that also to your fellow writers. And you seem particularly invested, if I'm not wrong, in writers who are grappling with this whole question of what comes out the histories that we have come, especially the colonial era. So this whole space that we are trying to figure out, post-colonialism, decoloniality, decolonization, depending on what people are dealing with. Am I right in that? How would you characterize, and why do you seem so invested in those kind of writers?
Oh, those kinds of writers. Well, because they're there. And they're interested in these things, and I am also interested in. So if I write about them, or sometimes I encounter them, or sometimes they encounter me, then I'm happy to support and to share their enthusiasm, because it's also mine. So it's not kind of strange or surprising in that respect. And these issues and these concerns are part of my experience of living, but also part of my intellectual interests, and indeed, I suppose, part of what I've been doing in the way of teaching and researching myself. And what often happens, if you're fortunate, is that the students that you teach, either at undergraduate level or at postgraduate level, or indeed who read things that you write, they say, I want to come and work with you. And so you also have a community in that sense, that you have students who come through, who come to you through your interests and develop their own interests as a result.
So I want to say two things to that. One is that some of them come and work with you, and some of them, decades later, say, I remember you as a teacher. And I don't know if MP Yusuf Hassan is here, but he was here on the first day and said, that was my teacher a long time ago. And I thought, how lovely. I don't know how many of us can remember. You know how you always have that one or two special teachers,
Yes,
which tells me about your teaching.
Yes, I met Yusuf Hassan yesterday. And of course, now he's an MP and whatever, but this was many, many years ago. We worked it out that it was something like 30-something years ago. Well, I'm glad he says that. I mean, what else can I add to that if he says that?
Okay, I'm going to ask them to start bringing the mic on. One last thing, I think I will bring what was going to be my closing comment. I think a lot of us have celebrated you for not just the prize, the Nobel, but for the other. You've been shortlisted for very many prizes. You have won other prizes. I think for me, the thing that was most special was when the Nobel was announced. Brittle Paper did an edition. I don't know if any of you saw that. And they talked to all these young writers across the continent. I think it was something like 100 of them. And how many of them said they were just excited, not only for the genius of the writing or whatever else they had picked, but how many of them talked about you being a mentor? How many of them said, he's quietly behind the scenes, with prizes like the Kane Prize, cheering us on, giving us advice, also telling us when we need to do better work and things like that. And then I became very aware that you also give shout outs to young upcoming writers, and you do it so naturally. It's not as if you're like, oh, okay, now I need to say who I've mentored, but really as part of what you do. So as the mic, I'm waiting for the mic to goes out so that we can start asking questions. What is this investment in the next generation that, in addition to everything else you're doing, you seem to have taken as such a high priority? Why is this so important to you?
Well, because they don't leave you alone. No, I'm teasing. No, I mean, you perhaps make it sound as if it was much more activist than it is. There are opportunities that occur. Let's say, for example, if you're on a panel judging stories or whatever, here we're talking about Yvonne. Where is Yvonne? There she is.
This is for the Kane Prize, Yvonne?
So the year Yvonne won a Kane Prize, I think I was the chair of the committee that awarded the prize. But that's not me doing. That's because she wrote a brilliant story. So it's really just, doing the right thing in a way, just being able to give a helping hand.
Beyond judging, then saying.
Well, beyond judging. And then I think then Yvonne and I talked and that sort of thing. And over the years, we've been in touch, and it's always been possible to celebrate her success and etc. And the same is true of Nadifa there, who's also here with us, and you've heard her speak so well. And so I remember her also getting in touch and saying, well, you mentioned it yesterday, and showing me something that she was working on, which turned later into her first novel. And I thought, this is good. She came down, we talked, and you said it doesn't require much effort to say encouraging things when you have good, promising work, great enthusiasm, and so on. So really, just doing what is the most obvious thing. I don't want to take any more credit than that, really, but just supporting what is there to be supported. And whenever occasions occur that you have this opportunity to speak generously for what deserves to be spoken about generously, then you do so.
Well, thank you. Thank you for doing that. I know from them, those who are modeling to them, what else needs to keep going. So, any questions? I see 1, 2, 3. I'll take 3 first. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll come back for another round.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name is Yuming Huan. I'm from China. It is an honor to be here to ask you a question. You mentioned the Swahili Utendi au Inkishafi, and this year's event didn't invite any Swahili writing writer. So my question is, how do you think of the current plight of Swahili literature and its future? And the second question is does Swahili traditional literary tradition influence your creative writing, if any, how? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The second, number 2.
My name is Momanyo Soro. Thank you for finding time to join us today. So my question is, what are your 3 favorite books? And also, who are the 3 favorite authors you enjoy reading? And finally, there's...
Other people have questions. No, I'm going to be really fair. Other people also have questions.
Yeah.
So those 2 questions?
Just one more.
No, 2 questions.
Please, one more.
No, I'm serious.
Let him do one
It's
more.
something he said, that's why I'm asking about it. Yeah.
But you're the last person who's getting away with it just because he has said so. I'm trying to be fair and get as many questions as possible.
Yeah, you talked about Crime and Punishment, and Fyodor did, there's another book he did, what was the name? Brothers Karamazov. What do you think of Brothers Karamazov? Because
you're a bad man. That is not even a question.
That's a paper, our seminar class. Okay, number 3. See, I know you Kenyans. Give you an inch, you take the whole nation. Number 3. Okay. Somebody was on that side. Oh dear, sorry. Okay, he'll start answering those 2 questions as the mic goes over.
All right, okay. I think you have a point, but that's question for the organizers. Would it not be a good idea to also have something about Swahili, a Swahili panel maybe? There are writers indeed who might have contributed to that very fruitfully. So you're right. Maybe it is something to think about. Or maybe that requires its own conference. I don't know. But that's not for me to answer, I don't think. The other question about influences, well, it's very difficult really to pin down influences, I find, because a person, but I think it's true of other writers, read so much, and read across such a wide range of different things, that it almost would need a kind of conscious decision to say, I'm going to write in a certain way in terms of influence. I mean, I'm going to do something that's going to reflect something of classical Swahili or something like that. And also maybe it's not a very productive way of thinking, because those things come out of their time, come out of the concerns of the time, which may not be the concerns I have now. It's wonderful to know, but it's also pretty good, I think, for a writer to feel I'm finding my own way through this. And I'm not doing this because so-and-so has done it, and I think that's a good example.
Thank you.
And your questions were?
Favorite writers.
Favorite writers. I'm afraid this is not an easy question to answer or as easy as you think. For precisely the reason that I've just mentioned, that is to say that you read a lot, you read so much, it's really difficult to say my favorite three are, because tomorrow they might not be, for a start. Or what are you reading right now? Well, right now I'm reading Peter Abrahams, for example, who is a writer that I think is kind of undeservedly obscure now. And so I'm reading it because I'm going to give a talk to say he is undeservedly obscure. So, for example. So it's both work as well as pleasure. And that's what I'm doing right now. Other than that, I have a pile of books at home, which people, one of the kindnesses as a result of being awarded the Nobel Prize is that people send you their books. So I have a pile of books, some of which will no doubt end up being my favorites as well.
Do you want to say anything about Dostoevsky?
About?
The seminar question on Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky. What was the question? Which between Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, and Brothers Karamazov? I think they're both wonderful books.
Okay, so we have the mic has now gone to, yes.
You mentioned earlier that when you moved to the UK, there was like an abundance in literature. But when you moved to the UK, there was like an abundance of literature. But were there any negatives? Like when you were a student, did you ever experience racism or inequality because you wanted to move into academics, even though you were in like a small community?
I don't think I experienced anything serious in the way of racism in school, as you were, in my academic experience. Not seriously. I do remember one lecture, which was actually on Macbeth, not Ionesco's, but Shakespeare's Macbeth. And the lecturer, who also happened to be the head of department, in a room with about 100 and something students, talking about Macbeth's autocracy, I suppose, the way he grew more and more authoritarian and more bloodlusting, that kind of thing. And then he looked around and fixed on me and said, "You would know about that, wouldn't you?" And I thought, yeah, sure, we know all about all this. So that there were moments like that, that is in the academy, as it were. So I think otherwise it wasn't anything serious. But of course, in the wider society, there were several moments, many of them casual moments, you know, a shopkeeper, or rather a shop assistant, or a bus driver, or sometimes when you apply for a job, particularly those kind of casual type jobs as a student and so on. And I also do remember actually the first teaching job that I applied for, the headmistress, it was quite a good school, you know. I said, hey, if I get that job, I'll be fine. And she interviewed me at length, only on her own, which is not common anymore, that you only have one person conducting an interview. But she interviewed me on her own. Oh, maybe that's not true, because her dog was in the room as well. Anyway, so she interviewed me on her own. And at the end of it, she said, you're absolutely wonderful. You're brilliant. You're brilliant. But I'm afraid I can't give you the job because I don't think you'll fit in. Which, of course, is a euphemism for saying, you know, you're not the right complexion. You know, sorry, buddy. So there are moments like that. But really, otherwise, this is what you learn to live with, I think, as a stranger in a place. That these are unavoidable sorts of responses almost everywhere. But here, there is a history of it. So coming to understand it, this is one of the things I was talking about when I was talking about reflecting on things. Coming to understand it is one of the things that became possible as a result of going to live there, rather than understanding it from a distance or from a story, as it were. And then understanding that it is actually, at that level anyway, manageable. There is another level of racism which is not manageable, when you're confronted by somebody with a great club in their hands or committing violence on you, either as a member of the public or indeed as a representative of the state. Then that's not avoidable, and that's not something you can, you know, sort of become strong about. But the other kinds of racism, you can probably learn to build up a defense against it.
Has this helped inform some of your writing on dislocation and people moving into spaces where they are faced with that same kind of dynamic?
Yeah, I try to be, you know, in many of my stories as well, there's some movement. And this movement is, this dislocation is also unsettling in a variety of ways, different ways. And so I kind of, I suppose I've been exploring the different ways in which that move from one place to another and being imaginatively still locked in another place, which I think inevitably we all are. I don't think it's possible to go from here and there and then just say, that's it, I've finished with that, done with that one. I think that's probably a common experience. You don't even have to change countries to have that experience.
Okay, number 4, 5, 6,
yeah,
4
here.
is right there, and then 5
Over here.
over there, and 6 standing.
Yeah, how do you manage to write about yourself without without feeling vain, without and manage to retain your objectivity?
A few years ago, Neil Young was given a Nobel in literature, and it sparked a debate on what should be considered as literature because he's a musician. So my question is, this week, the Nobel Committee will start announcing the winners. Should we expect maybe something different again? Would you nominate a musician for, for Nobel in literature?
A number of times I have been opportune to encounter great minds, and one thing comes to my mind. When I look at them, I see the future that will one day end. And I ask myself, so one day, this person will cease to be in this world. So as I look at Professor right now, I ask myself that question. So one day, the world will cease having a person like him. So I wish to ask you, Prof, have you ever considered as a matter of personal priority, producing people like you, or people of greater minds like you, as a matter of personal project? Thank you.
Okay.
That's well, you mean clone myself? No, I have not. I like the idea. I like the idea of being unique. I'm sorry, I didn't really hear the end of that question, the first question. Can I ask you, please, excuse me, can I ask you, I didn't hear the last part of that question.
Basically, I was just asking is, how do you manage to write about your personal experiences and about yourself without feeling vain?
Without feeling pain.
Vain.
Vain.
Vanity.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, how do you know they're my personal experiences?
Well, you said so yourself in the beginning of your book. You said something about, yeah, you feel compelled to write about your account for yourself in a way, and
Yeah,
your
but
writing
that's-
is very personal. So
That's not me. That's the narrator talking.
right.
I mean, that is the narrator. That's the old man who's a character in the novel. So he's talking about the compulsion to relate his experience. It wasn't my experience.
Are you talking about when he said he was writing to understand the world?
Basically, I'm talking about the character, but I'm assuming that in elements of the character is you.
No, you're talking about By the Sea.
Yes.
And the narrator in By the Sea, the older man, does say at some point, I feel compelled to relate, to tell my story.
Yeah.
But that's not me.
Okay, but you personally, how do you manage to write? Because I feel like writing in a personal word instead of using the third person or something sort of brings a spotlight on you, and you end up sounding like I. So how do you negate from that?
Yeah, but your question was, how do you do that without being vain? Yeah. And because it's nothing to do with me, I don't feel at all vain. I'm exploring the experience of somebody who's an older man who becomes a refugee. And I was making him tell his story. I was imagining how he might tell his story. Nothing to do with me. What was the other question? Sorry, can you remind me, what was the other question?
The Nobel Committee.
Oh, musician, no. I think these are different activities. I don't know how come they gave the Nobel Prize to Bob Dylan. Is that who you're talking about? It's not that I don't think Bob Dylan is a wonderful, great music maker, but it's a different activity. And I think, fine, they did it. That's their business. Swedish Academy makes their decision. They make the decision about Dylan. They make the decision about me. I don't argue with that. But what I'm saying is that if it were me, I would say making music is a different activity from writing or from literature.
I don't know many people say, and one thing we didn't talk about was the kind of supportive role that family plays. And you have been an embodiment of why writers find family so important. So thank you very much. And most of all, Prof, thank you so, so much for the books, for the mentorship, for the intellectual leadership, and all the best in the years to come.